I will now invite Ms. Ofa-Ki-Levuka, Guttenbeil-Likiliki, who is the Director for Women and Children at the Crisis Center in Tonga, and she will speak today on the impact of strong patriarchal norms on the effectiveness of family protection orders and police safety orders in Tonga. I will now invite Ofa to the floor to make her presentation. You have the floor now, ma'am. You have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Malolele, just checking my audio levels. Is it okay?
Yes, Ofa, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Ko peke o hufanga te ngai whatako oso no Ofa-Ki pa ko lea te whainga maria koe ni ka o hoko atu he konga koe po kalama, Malolele from Tonga. Thank you, William, for that introduction. I'm just going to start with an example of internalized patriarchy. So it's a case study that I will share with all of you this morning, and just to remind any of our listeners and our women who are tuned in that if any of this triggers any of us, that of course there are agencies and there are crisis services that we can forward in the chat box if you require to access any counselling services. I was married to a very abusive man. It took me a long time to understand that I was a survivor of violence. In fact, it took me just over 20 years of violence and abuse to understand that what was happening to me was not normal. Since the day we got married, I was told and reminded many, many times of my role as a wife. That was to ensure that all my husband's needs were met. I was to cook for him, wash his clothes, clean the house, and also tend to his family needs, especially his father and elderly grandmother and grandfather who was living with us. This became all my sole responsibility as a good Tongan wife at the age of 20. Eventually we had children, in fact, 7 children. All 7 children were my responsibility. Whenever I failed to uphold these expectations, I was disciplined by my husband. For example, one day I remember I was to boil some hot water for my husband's grandfather to take a shower. Once the water was hot, I poured it into the shower tin with some cool water to make it warm. My child number 2, who at the time was playing around that area, she was about 3 or 4 years old, ran past and jumped into the shower tin. And because of her muddy feet, the water was no longer fit for my husband's grandfather, who was sitting inside the shower waiting for me to take the shower tin in. I called out and asked him to wait as I needed to boil some more water as the water was dirty because of my child's feet. My husband, hearing this, became very angry. He came from behind me, yelling and screaming at me, telling me how useless I was and careless that his grandfather was sitting waiting inside the shower, cold, because of my stupidity. He grabbed my neck and pushed me down on the ground. He pulled my hair up to push my face inside the shower tin as if to drown my face inside the water. He then pulled my face up, grabbing my hair and punched me right in the face. He then told me to hurry up and go and boil the water despite blood coming out of my nose. When my mother found out about what had happened, she told me off for not being more careful. And she said that I should have beaten my child for being careless as well. And that if I had beaten my child, she would learn and never do that again. Another incident was when I was pregnant with child number 5. And the doctor advised me that I should think about contraception or tubal ligation as my health was not 100%. I told my husband that I wanted to get it, and he told me to shut up and that I was not allowed. When I asked him again, he accused me of wanting to have sexual affairs with other men. That was why I wanted to take the contraception. And he proceeded to strangle me, and then he forced me to have sex, and he was very violent while he was doing it. I didn't know that this was marital rape until my counselling sessions. I thought I would just share that one story of many, many, many other stories, just to draw a picture of just how complex it is and how difficult the situation is here in Tonga, and of course, I would imagine so across the Pacific, of how difficult it is to deal with cases of violence against women and young girls in Tonga, being a very conservative, traditional, and very much a patriarchal society. Just a brief overview of WCC, the Women and Children Crisis Centre statistics. So we've managed to collect data and statistics from 2014 of when the Family Protection Act came into force. It was passed by the Legislative Assembly in 2013, and of course assented to by the King, and then we started to use it in 2014. So in all, we've, up until 2020, I've managed to identify 108 police safety orders that our counsellors have directly been involved in terms of our counsellor advocates working with the police to get these orders issued. And in addition to that, 90 protection orders. So that was direct applications to the court. Of course, the Family Protection Legal Aid Centre didn't start till 2018. So a lot of this work was done by counsellors working closely with the courts as well as the police. But in saying that, sadly, the percentage of the total number of cases, if we're talking about police safety orders and protection orders that we've directly dealt with, 198 in total since 2014, 47% of those have been breached. And I think that's a critical point of discussion that we need to discuss today, because although, you know, they're just words on paper, we need to talk about the reality of, you know, how far is this protection working for our women and our young girls. So just some challenges with the police safety orders and the protection orders that we have observed and discussed many, many, many times here at the Crisis Centre. So I'll just go through some quick bullet points. The attitudes and behaviours of key agencies, so police, extended family members, judiciary, even workers in the crisis centres and the non-government organisation spaces, that still find some kind of window to justify the violence and the abuse that has been perpetrated against the woman. And this, you know, to understand this is to understand genderization of how we are raised in Tonga, what we have been taught to believe, you know, the roles and the expectations on women and girls, and the roles and expectations of men and boys. And embedded in that is that, you know, leadership, power, control is delegated to our men. Whereas for our women, we have to be submissive, humble, accepting, and of course, forgiving. And with these characteristics, these traits, these social obligations, responsibilities, all expected of you, just because you were born a female or a male, then translates into every other thing that we do here in Tonga, every other space that we are a part of. So for example, we're taught these things as young as babies into our childhood. We go to school, we're taught the same thing in school. That's one of the issues that we're advocating and lobbying for from the Crisis Centre, is for a curriculum reform to teach our children about gender equality, gender equity, and that if you're not being taught this at home, that you need a safe space to learn about it. Because when you're being taught at home about these gender norms that are being reiterated and that are being honed into us, and then we go from there into the classroom, and again it's being reiterated in the classroom, then of course we're going to internalize it. And once we internalize it, we believe it here and we believe it here. And that becomes really difficult and challenging to change, especially when we move into institutions and become leaders of those institutions or implementers in those institutions. For example, police, the judiciary, non-government organizations, the health sector. And then eventually when we develop our own families. So everything that we have learned as children, that we have genderized, and then we have internalized, we've connected that, the heart and the head. We then practice that, and we implement, everything that we implement from the institutions that we're a part of is based on that, is based on those patriarchal beliefs and strongly embedded cultural, social norms. And it's very difficult to change. And so when we have that clear understanding, we can then apply that to how well are the police safety orders or the protection orders in the court working. We can look at, my second bullet point is we can look at the land laws, and I've touched already upon culture and religion, the way we are raised. The man is the head of the household. Woman, be submissive to your husbands. The land laws, for example, women cannot register land in Tonga. This is reserved, legally reserved for our men. So when police safety orders are issued or serviced, what do you think the men say? Of course, they will turn around and say to their wives, you get off my land. You go away somewhere else and seek safety somewhere else. This is my house. This is my land. Sorry, I'm holding my phone because my desktop is not working for the... So we need to look at those realities, because this is what is what women are facing here in Tonga. It's not easy to remove the perpetrator from the home when he legally owns the home and he legally owns the land. So you can imagine that. Worse off is if the surrounding neighbors or the surrounding homes are his family. How do you think this will... Sorry, William, can you still hear me?
Yes, Ofa, loud and clear.
How do you think this will be received by police turning up to remove the owner of the land and the owner of the house from the home for up to 7 days? Okay, so he's removed, but then the surrounding homes are his family. I don't think many of our women would be able to handle that. So of course our safe houses is always being used because of that fact. We have to bring in the reality of our land laws and how discriminative they are, because this is what it results in when we're trying to apply police safety orders or even protection orders. So most often than not, the woman will remove herself from the home, unless of course it's a rental accommodation or it's her family home. But most of the time, in the Tongan context, the majority of the women leave their home and go to live with their husbands. Of course, the other issue that I've got here is about delayed processes. Justice delayed is justice denied. And we often talk about this. So when police safety orders are to be serviced or protection orders, and the police are, they're going around trying to find the perpetrator, whether it's here on the main island or one of their outer islands. In the first 24 hours pass and they can't find the perpetrator, we always say, we also help. The crisis centre counsellor advocates always try to help and assist in this process by trying to find out from the survivor or from people connected to the survivor as to possible locations where the perpetrator is. And when we feed this information to the police, sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not helpful for them. They, there are very good police officers who take the information and then they actually go to the locations that we have provided the information about and find the perpetrator. And then there are those police, because of the genderization, the internalization, and then the institutionalization, they don't want the information. They don't want to use the information. And the whole strategy is to delay the access to justice, because within that, once we pass the 48-hour window, most often the survivor will come back and say, he's contacted me, he's asked for forgiveness, or somebody in the family has already approached her, asked for forgiveness, and no longer wants to go ahead with it. So, we're always mindful of this key fact, and I hope that we continue to talk about that today, because I know because of time, I don't have a lot of time to really delve into that. The other bullet point that I've got here that I would like to talk about is the first come, first serve approach of the Family Protection Legal Aid Centre. We have a very good working relationship. However, this issue around the first come, first serve approach is a point of discussion that I hope that we are able to dig deeper into, because as a legal aid centre, if the perpetrator first approaches them, so the perpetrator in Alvin, if the husband approaches them first, they will take the case on his behalf. So if the survivor approaches them, they've already taken the perpetrator's story as a survivor. So the framing of the perpetrator as a survivor is a complex issue that those of us who are working in the area of ending all forms of violence against women and girls need to understand carefully and deeply before we move into the space. Otherwise, it'll end up a double-edged sword for women, particularly for women and our young girls. So it takes away from understanding the complexities of patriarchal norms, deeply entrenched gender inequalities. And then we start to question, in that situation, you need to question who holds the power and the privilege in that situation, even if they call themselves a survivor. So I'll give you an example. A woman had asked for a protection order, and she was in the shower. So she applied for the protection order, she got it. She was at home with her young daughter. She was in the shower, she left her phone on the bed. There was a knock at the door. Her little girl went and opened the door because she heard the voice, and the voice was familiar to her. It was her father. The protection order was against her father. So the young girl opened the door, rightly so, because it's her father. He then entered the house. He went up to the bedroom, got the wife's phone on the bed and started doing whatever he was trying to do on the phone. The wife came out of the shower, hearing his voice, of course was traumatized and started screaming and said, "What are you doing here?" She was just in her towel. She approached him to take the phone off his hand. They then ended up on the bed in a shuffle with each other. He then called the police and filed a complaint of attempted rape on her. And of course, we got involved at a later stage, but hearing the events of the situation, this is why at the Crisis Centre, we say we really have to tread carefully when it comes to protection orders and safety orders and breaching of those, to understand how perpetrators can strategically use their privilege and their power to mastermind and manipulate the system and manipulate processes. And I can't really go into it much deeper because of the time limit. But I think that's a clear example of what we're dealing with. Also, just recently in the last year, the Crisis Centre has experienced some backlash with the courts. So while we have some really good, and I want to acknowledge Salome from our courts here, who's a really wonderful clerk and really does go out of her way to help our counsellor advocates here at the Crisis Centre. But not everybody is Salome, and that's the reality. And some of our counsellor advocates have been stopped from filing directly with the courts. And, you know, this is a discussion that we have to have because this is the reality. And, you know, a few of them have been directed by not Magistrate Langi, but another magistrate, to go directly to the Family Protection Legal Aid Centre and file through them. However, there is a right to file directly to the court and use the clerks there. So, you know, we want to talk about these barriers and these challenges as real issues, because there are some situations, because Tonga is a small country, everybody knows everybody. And so if the survivor says, I don't want to use the services of the Free Legal Aid Centre, I would like you to assist me directly to the courts, then she should have that option. And rightly so, vice versa. If somebody says at the Free Legal Aid Centre, we don't want to go through the Crisis Centre, we would rather another service. I mean, those options should be there and they should be accessible. And it should never be you know, a challenge and a barrier to access justice. And just to finish off, William, because I know I've got a few more, probably just a minute or two left. In this whole area of ending violence against women, one of the biggest obstacles that I see, and I see as the leader from the Women and Children Crisis Centre, is this hierarchical positioning. You know, the crisis centres are always looked at as, you know, they were questioned about their credibility. The counsellors are questioned, where did you get your schooling? Where is your certificate? Their validity, you know, their validity and their credibility is always questioned. And because Tonga is such a stratified society, we're such a hierarchical society, we automatically place ourselves within that hierarchy. And so I think that we need to also acknowledge that, you know, with these legal aid centres transitioning into government services, we should not forget the work that's done on the ground by crisis centres and non-government organisations. We should always acknowledge the work that they're doing, because I heard in one of the conversations held earlier that the first point of access to justice is the police. And I would like to argue that I don't believe that is so. I would say that this starts much earlier. As soon as the survivor reaches out to somebody to be brave enough and to tell her story, that is her first point of access to justice. The fact that she has got the courage to speak out and seek help, whether it's with the crisis centre, whether it's with a friend, whether it's with a colleague, this is the first point of access to justice, that she has spoken out. She wants to tell her story. She needs help, and two, she wants the violence to stop. That is the point where her journey begins. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And with that said, I look forward to hearing more of the presentations, and I'm willing to answer any more questions as they come through. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ofa. Thank you for that presentation. Thank you as well for having the courage to share your personal experience of your life and your history of violence. And thank you for talking on the great work that the Tonga Women's Crisis Centre has done in the span of working around violence against women and helping survivors as well. We also share the same sentiments and the challenges as well, and we're able to, for everybody present here, will also take that note down as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ms. Stephanie Dunn. She is the Legal and Advocacy Officer at the Fiji Women's Crisis Centre, and she will be presenting today on the topic, Accessing Family Protection Orders in the Pacific, the Gaps and the Challenges. I now welcome Ms. Dunn to the floor to make her presentation. Ms. Dunn, you have the floor. You have 20 minutes. Thank you, Ms. Dunn.
Thank you so much, William. And thank you again, Ofa, for such a wonderful and passionate presentation. And it leads very nicely into the next presentation, which is accessing. And when I'm doing my presentation, I'd like you to keep at the back of your minds what Ofa had said in terms of patriarchy and the power imbalances that we see, because that in fact does play a very major part in terms of accessing justice, especially for our survivors who are predominantly women. Now, just to the group, whenever we think of the Pacific, we always think of it as paradise, sunny beaches, smiling faces, very relaxing atmosphere. But a lot of us that are here living in the Pacific know that beneath this wonderful tourism-like depiction of the Pacific, we have a big issue of domestic violence. You look at the statistics that has been provided previously by Naomi, the statistic that was provided by our panelists before this. It paints a very daunting picture of the realities that the Pacific is being faced with. Now, one of the things that we have seen is, while there has been great development in terms of development of our legislations, our policies and practices around getting protection orders for survivors, one of the things that we have seen, especially in terms of access, is what my whole presentation will be about today. So Ofa has already gone over quite a lot of what I had wanted to present today. And it reminded me of something, that while each one of our nations are divided by oceans, we all face quite similar challenges and issues when trying to access justice. So while we have already 13 countries, and I think there are about 14 different legislations that have been out there, we have seen that in terms of accessing justice, survivors have a bit more difficulty in trying to, especially when they're trying to have access through the police. And we've noticed that, especially with service or enforcement agencies like the police, they either do not know or understand the laws. And it comes back to what Nehemiah had said earlier. While we may have very beautiful words on paper, a very progressive legislation in our country, it's going to come back to how it's going to be enforced on the ground. And a key part of that enforcement are our police. A lot of our domestic violence or protection order legislations across the Pacific, the police play a very key part, especially at the enforcement part, and also ensuring that protection or getting protection orders for survivors is done in a timely manner. Unfortunately, while they have been given these mandatory duties, a lot of our enforcement agencies, like the police across the Pacific, don't know their mandatory duties under their respective legislations. And while some may know, they don't understand it fully. So one of the things that we've seen and experienced through either our network members or through FWCC, through our consular advocates, is that when they are trying to actually fill out the forms, you notice that police officers don't know how to make the application. That's one. And two, how to access courts outside normal hours, which is a crucial part, being that they're the only institution in most of our legislations to be able to reach out to the courts and get an application or get an order over the phone. Now, Tonga has a bit more progressive legislation in terms of the police giving the orders, whereas in Fiji, it's usually done over the phone, and the courts are the ones that are key partners in ensuring that these orders come out. Now, one of the things that we've also noticed, and keeping in mind about patriarchy and the fact that a lot of our countries, specific countries, have patriarchal sort of culture in place, we've noticed that the language of the legislation also creates a barrier because it's gender neutral, and it does not really, with gender neutral legislations, it does not really recognize the gender nature of domestic violence, because usually gender neutral legislations work on the assumption that everyone is treated equal on the ground. And you heard Ofa's presentation of a case study from Tonga. That's not the case. And even for Fiji, we've seen women who try and access these services, and they're reinforced ideologies that you have to remember their vows when till death do us part. When they approach enforcement agencies like the police, sometimes even the courts, where the registries or even the police remind them that if you're going to file or make this application, or you're going to take him to court, it might impact his employment. Think about the family, think about your reputation. And unfortunately, a lot of these survivors who it takes so much courage for them just to step up and step out to get the assistance that they needed, when they are bombarded with questions like, think of your family, think of your marital vows, they feel discouraged. And at most times, they end up thinking that it's their fault, that it must be them. That is why when in terms of accessing justice, it's important that we keep in the back of our minds, especially accessing these legislations, that there's a huge power imbalance between survivors and perpetrators. And we need to keep that in mind when we are drafting our legislations, when we're going to implement new policies and practices to better the enforcement, to improve access to justice for our survivors. One of the things that we have seen, at least with the Pacific, is a lot of our centers, like the Tongan Women and Children's Crisis Center, Kiribati Women's Crisis Center, the Family Support Center at Solomon Islands, a lot of them are providing responsive services, and also that engaging with communities to try and change their mindsets. We always say that as part of access to justice, it's also ensuring that everyone is on the same page. That while you have a legislation, it's ensuring that all the key stakeholders know their duties under that legislation and know their referral pathways. If someone comes to if somebody comes to the police and say they do not want to report a domestic violence breach, we need to understand why they're not doing that. So making the necessary referrals to organizations, to the individual respective organizations that you have in your countries. There's also the need, and I think Ofa has already explained on this, the need for gender sensitization training, because this would help key service providers like the police, like the courts, in responding appropriately and sensitively. One of the things that we've seen, and Fiji, like many of our other Pacific countries, it's a very small community. We all know each other. We all, one way or another, know so-and-so. We know the police officer here. And one of the things that we've seen is that the perception of the justice system, how a lot of women do not want to access it because they say, okay, we did, so-and-so had made the application. Unfortunately, the police had said that, we can't. That's your husband. Think of the family. Think about who will support you if he goes in, or if you're going to get a restraining order, where will you stay? The other things we've also seen in terms of unnecessary delays. Sometimes while they have been given interim orders, trying to get them finalized within a short period of time is quite difficult. And what Ofa earlier stated is quite true. Justice delayed is justice denied. And unfortunately, the longer it goes, sometimes survivors are unable to come to court because of cost. And a lot of our courts as well are usually in urban areas, making it more difficult for those that are in rural areas to access. We also need to look at the insensitivity of the service providers. We have questions that are made in court where survivors feel that they are the ones being attacked. We've had a survivor that has disclosed that when she went to court to try and argue her point as to why the application was made, the bench had actually highlighted to her and said, this is why, can you please talk slowly? This is why your husband has filed a DVRO against you, because you talk too much for a woman. So can you imagine comments like that? And sort of what she said is, after that comment, she had tried to go and withdraw, try and make an application for that to be struck out, but she was so frightened and just agreed to the orders because she thought she was the one to blame. And I think it's very important to take into account that sometimes while you may have fancy legislations, you may have legal aid services available, but ensuring that these services are accessible to those that need it the most is very important. It's important to take into account the geographical location of the different Pacific countries that we live in. I'll take, for example, even Tonga has, there are multiple islands. It's a bit more harder to kind of access courts when they're at a centralized location. The other is ensuring that they can actually travel there because the cost. Another is, especially during COVID-19 and when we had these various lockdowns, we noticed that a lot of these service providers had shifted online. Now, while shifting online was good for some of the survivors that we'd had to assist had expressed that it was a bit more difficult to access online, especially when they don't even have a home to stay in, when they don't even have a phone to access these things. Another difficulty that also highlighted the cost of getting data to access these services are even more harder for them when they can't even afford the food to be put into their bellies, as well as shelter for their children and themselves. That's why it's always important that when we're trying to access, also looking at the geographical location, how easily accessible is it not only for women in this position, but women with disabilities? How are they able to access your office? Is there interpretation for those that have hearing impairment? Is there a ramp to allow those that have physical impairment? So these are sort of questions that needs to be answered. And I know a lot of changes or a lot of progress has been done, but there's still a lot more room needed in areas like this. We've had women with disabilities, especially those with hearing impairment, that have said there was slight delay in terms of application because one, there was no interpreter in this different agencies. So whether they're the police, they need to wait and get someone else to come in and interpret and try and get them to fill out the form. For those that have visual impairments, it's a bit more difficult for them to get it filled, and trying to get someone to assist them is even more difficult. So just to understand the realities of where they're coming from. And some of them, what they have noted is that when they've gone to access these services, when they've gone, especially for those with disabilities, usually they are put with comments like, oh, but you're not a real woman. You know, if you leave that man, you won't be able to get another man. So think about that. So a lot of them have said that their value as a human being is put down because they have a disability. And that's why it's important that gender sensitized training is done. And not only just done, but done by the right organizations and experts in their fields. You've got for Tonga, the Tongan Women and Children Crisis Center. You've got for Fiji, the Fiji Women's Crisis Center. Vanuatu, the Vanuatu Women's Crisis Center. And you have in Kiribati. You also have in Solomon Islands, the Family Law Family Center. And you have various organizations that are there that have been working in this field for a very, very long time. And it's good to recognize their expertise, and it's good to engage these experts because one, they are localized. They understand the context in which they're operating from, the difficulties. Another one of the things that we have seen, at least in terms of access, is ensuring that most of this, if you've noticed, most of the documents for court are in a language that is usually English. And a lot of them need interpretation and trying to understand what each of these documents or legal terminology means. It's also very important to, when we are looking at accessing justice and when we are trying to think, we also need to recognize that while it does not cost you to apply for DVRO, you need to understand that cost is not only at the courthouse. The cost builds up for the woman, for her to, when she travels from her home to try and access the particular service. Especially during lockdowns, where they have to print the forms, having access to actually pay for internet to allow them to download the forms, to pay for printing of the forms, and also trying to travel from point A, at least from the printing area, to the courts. Though all of that put together, it's quite costly. So I think my time is almost up, but one of the things that I just want to put at the end is it's always important to understand that there is a huge power imbalance between the survivors and the perpetrators. Recognizing this and also taking into account the patriarchal structures that we have, it'll give you a better protection for survivors. Ensuring that there's inclusivity for survivors, whether they have disabilities, depending on the languages that they speak, is very important. You cannot have a one shoe fit all solution at all times. It's important to look at your regulations, look at your provisions of the law, and see how well you can better improve the access to services for survivors. And I was very happy about the outcomes document that prioritized counseling. So while we're also looking at accessing services, it's also assisting survivors of coming out of these violent situations and trying to improve the situation for them and their children. So not just getting a family protection order and that's it. No, it's about getting them to a safe place, getting them economic participation so that they're able to support themselves and their children, and ensuring that they are in a better position from when they had started trying to access the service to when they're going to eventually come out of that violent situation. So with this, I'd like to, I think I end my presentation and I hand it over to William for any other questions, should the plenary ask.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that wonderful presentation. Just to highlight and for everyone to be reminded that we've gone slightly over time, and given that we have a wide variety of upcoming speakers, we kindly request if you can keep your questions or comments just on the chat box. The panelists will be able to address that as well. Stephanie and Ofa will be online as well to address that on the chat box. So we'll move on. Just before I move on, I'd like to commend and thank you both for being speakers here today and for the great work that the Fiji Women's Crisis Center and the Tonga Women's Crisis Center has done in the space of assisting survivors of domestic violence. Thank you so much for your commitment, and thank you for all the great work that you've done in terms of empowering women.